In 1970, a family hiking in a remote valley near Bergen, Norway, came across the burned body of an unidentified woman. Her face was damaged beyond recognition. The labels on her clothes had been removed. Days later, police found suitcases linked to her filled with wigs, strange travel items, and coded notes. She had moved across Europe under false names. And more than 50 years later, no one can say with certainty who she was or why she died alone in Ice Valley. My name is Ilyas, and tonight we open another file from the Cold Case Atlas. Case number 002, Bergen, Norway, the Isdal Woman. Pay close attention. Let's begin. On the morning of November 29th, 1970, a man and his two young daughters were hiking in Isdalen, a remote valley outside Bergen, Norway. What they found was not the kind of scene anyone forgets. Lying among the rocks was the body of a woman. She had been badly burned. The front of her body and much of her clothing were destroyed. Her face was difficult to recognize. Around her were scattered objects, bottles, personal items, burned paper, and signs that someone had tried very carefully to erase her identity. This was not a normal, unattended death in the wilderness. It looked staged, or hidden, or both. Investigators quickly noticed details that made the case even stranger. The labels had been removed from her clothing and from many of the items around her. Identifying marks had been scratched away or cut out. There were traces of petrol. There were burned papers near the body. There was no straightforward way to say, this is who she was. And then came the autopsy. The woman had phenobarbital sleeping pills in her system. She had also inhaled carbon monoxide. Soot in her lungs suggested she was still breathing while the fire burned. Her neck showed bruising that investigators could not fully explain. Officially, police leaned toward suicide. But from the beginning, the scene seemed to resist that conclusion. 3 days later, the case widened dramatically. Police found 2 suitcases linked to the woman at Bergen railway station. Inside was a collection of items that made the mystery feel less like a tragedy in the woods and more like a life carefully constructed in secret. There were wigs, clothing, cosmetics, foreign currency, glasses, maps, timetables, a notepad, travel items from multiple countries, and once again, identifying labels had been removed. The suitcases did not tell police who she was, but they made one thing clear. This woman had not arrived in Bergen by accident. She had been moving with intention, and she had been trying very hard not to be traced. As investigators worked through hotel records and coded notes, a pattern began to emerge. The unknown woman had traveled through Norway and beyond using multiple aliases. She had checked into hotels under different names. Details changed from one form to another, but certain patterns repeated. She often claimed Belgian nationality. The forms were filled out in German or French. Witnesses described her as guarded, stylish, and hard to read. Some said she spoke German. Others thought she spoke Flemish or broken English. Several remembered wigs. And then there was the notepad. Police eventually decoded the entries and concluded that they referred to dates and places she had visited. Suddenly, the dead woman in the valley was no longer just unidentified. She had become someone who had been deliberately moving through Europe under layers of false identity. At first, this feels simple. A woman hiding herself from the world. But the deeper this case goes, the less it behaves like an ordinary disappearance. Because if this was only a solitary act of self-erasure, why does so much of the case feel operational? Why the wigs? Why the repeated travel under aliases? Why the coded notepad? Why the removed labels on so many separate items? And why does the woman's route seem so structured? Even the scene itself creates resistance. Soot in the lungs suggests that she was alive during the fire. Bruising on the neck left room for doubt. The official verdict may have been suicide, but many people, including later investigators and journalists, felt that the case never settled comfortably into that explanation. The first theory explains the desire to disappear. It does not fully explain the method, the preparation, or the atmosphere of secrecy surrounding her life. That brings us to the theory that made the Isdal Woman famous: espionage. The Cold War forms the background of this case, whether we wanted to or not. The woman traveled under false identities. She appeared in multiple cities. She used wigs. She kept coded notes. She guarded her movements. She may have spoken several languages, and some later reporting suggested that parts of her route overlapped with areas that were sensitive in Cold War Norway. Suddenly, the entire story changes shape. The woman in the valley is no longer just a hidden traveler. She becomes a possible courier, a watcher, a messenger, someone moving between borders, hotels, and railway stations with a purpose she could never safely write down. This theory is powerful for one reason. It makes the strangeness of the case feel intentional, not tragic, not random, intentional. But once again, the case pushes back because espionage explains the mood of the mystery better than it explains the death itself. It tells us why she may have used aliases, why she may have disguised herself, why she may have traveled quietly. But it does not give us a clean answer to what happened in Isdal. Was she killed, abandoned, forced into silence, or did a hidden life eventually collapse under its own pressure? The spy theory remains compelling because it gives the case shape, but shape is not proof. And in cold cases like this, that distinction matters. A false name can explain a journey. It cannot explain a death. And that is where this case refuses to stay solved. So let us try a third possibility. What if the Isdal woman was not a lone mysterious traveler, but part of something larger? Not necessarily an intelligence service in the dramatic cinematic sense, not necessarily a single spy thriller explanation, but perhaps a hidden network, criminal, political, intelligence adjacent, or compartmentalized in a way that made her life look fragmented from the outside. That theory would explain why everything around her identity seemed layered. Why there were multiple names but no real name. Why there were movements but no personal story. Why there was planning but no obvious destination. It also helps explain the feeling many people have when they study the case, that the woman seems less like a tourist and more like someone performing a role. But again, the problem is proof. A hidden network is one of those explanations that can absorb almost every strange detail, and because of that, it can also become too convenient. If the older evidence could not fully identify her, maybe modern forensics could. Decades later, investigators returned to one of the most unusual pieces of preserved evidence: her jaw and teeth. Stable isotope analysis suggested that the woman may have been born around 1,930 inches or near Nuremberg, Germany. It also suggested that she had likely moved in childhood toward the French-German border region. Handwriting analysis pointed in a similar direction, suggesting education in a French-speaking environment or nearby. Later commentary around the case also raised the possibility of ties to French-speaking Belgium. These were not final answers, but they mattered. For the first time, the Isdal woman became slightly less abstract, not identified, but narrowed, not solved, but brought closer to the world of real geography, real childhood, and a real past. So where does that leave us? Maybe the most honest answer is that this case is not built around one mystery, but two. The first mystery is identity. Who was she really? The second's death. What happened in that valley? And those two mysteries may be connected without being identical. The Isdal woman may well have lived a hidden or compartmentalized life. The aliases, the travel pattern, and the erased labels strongly suggest that secrecy was not incidental. At the same time, the scene of her death still resists simple interpretation. The official verdict has never fully satisfied the deeper emotional logic of the evidence. So perhaps the most plausible explanation is not a neat one. A woman living behind constructed identities, a life organized around concealment, a final journey that ended in circumstances still impossible to reduce to one clean theory, not a puzzle with one answer, a puzzle with several incomplete ones. Maybe that is why the Isdal woman still haunts people, because she feels close enough to reality to be human, but distant enough to remain unreachable. We know where she died. We know some of the names she used. We know fragments of where she went. We know something about where she may have come from. And still, the center of the story remains empty. Not because there are no clues, but because the clues seem to belong to a life that was designed not to be understood all at once. Some mysteries survive because the evidence is missing. This one survives because the evidence is there and still refuses to become a complete person. Somewhere in this story, the truth was buried. What theories do you know? Write them in the comments. I read everyone. One file closed. Another one waiting. I'm Ilias, and I'll see you in the next case.